So let's hear more about his journey and welcome Lance Crane to the stage.
Thank you and good afternoon. Over 360,000 children under the age of 5 die every year from diarrhea caused by poor sanitation. Let's think about that for a minute. By the end of today, another 1,000 children will die, and it's totally preventable. I was unaware of this massive problem when we got involved with the Gates Foundation 18 months ago. And so as we were starting to think about solutions, the foundation said, hold it, you need to go see the problem. And so they encouraged us to go to Africa. And so that's what we did. So I want to share our story. We visited Accra in Ghana, and we visited Kampala in Uganda. It's my little airplane. We saw firsthand the intensifying urbanization as Accra used to be a city 10 years ago of 2 million people and now is 6 million people. Many of those people flooding into informal settlements and choking the city with traffic and obviously creating poor sanitation situations. So this is our group, 8 of us, and then we were also joined by 2 people in from the foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the conditions we saw. I'm going to talk a little bit about sanitation, and we'll talk about the businesses of sanitation. I know many of you are in businesses in sanitation. We'll talk about some of the challenges that we witnessed. So starting with some of the living conditions, this is actually Jamestown on the Atlantic Ocean, and we saw a lot of poor one-room structures literally on top of each other, makeshift. They could blow away in the wind, and no running water, no plumbing, dirt floors many of the times, and doing laundry out on the street. We also saw kids playing out in dried waste piles. We saw a lot of these examples where you have a trench running through the neighborhood, okay, that has trash, fecal matter, and in the rainy season, they flood dwellings like this, and you can see the sandbags. This is another example of that, and we saw it in every settlement we went to. We met George. He's an 8-year-old boy who lived in one of the informal settlements, and George was a happy kid. We saw him actually playing on one of these dried waste piles right next to a pit latrine, which of course is unsettling to see. But George was a happy kid until we asked him if he went to school. His head just went down, and he said no, he didn't go to school. So he spends his days playing with his friends, as you can see there, in a very unsafe area. And we kind of talked a lot about George as we left the development, that George really has a really tough time, or will have a tough time, reaching his true potential because of where he was born, where he lives, and the conditions. But one of the worst places we saw was outside of Accra, a place called Old Fatima, and its nickname is Sodom and Gomorrah. And some of our host folks took us to this area, and it was just unbelievable. I still have, in fact, we have some people in the room that were with us on that trip. As you can see, there's a river of garbage and fecal matter, and the smell was unbelievable. Burning piles of trash everywhere you could see. Loud music blaring, drugs and prostitution happening right before our eyes. And the conditions were terrible. If you can see, these were living quarters. The hosts that we were with became so uncomfortable that they kind of shooed us out of the area. We felt a lot of danger in that area. But these are places that need our help. A sanitation fact is disease transmitted through human waste contaminated water causes 115 deaths every hour in Africa. What we see again and again as we talk to people is the public really doesn't correlate fecal contamination and health issues. Then we looked at more of the sanitation issues, okay? And we went to one of the beaches, and there was a clear sign that said, no toilet at the beach. But clearly, when we saw all these red flags along the beach, we asked them, like, what is that? Well, that's where there was open defecation, and there was so much fecal matter that you couldn't be safely over in those areas. So that's still happening. We went outside of Roclaw to a beach called Lavender Hill, which was a funny nickname for a place that had been dumping human waste for 200 years. And only 2 or 3 years ago, they stopped doing it. Officially, it was outlawed when the Lavender Hill waste treatment plant opened just down the road. Yet we saw septic trucks, vacuum trucks pulling up. And after they went to the waste treatment plant, they would still go over to the beach, and the silt and sand that built up in those trucks was then removed, no doubt filled and contaminated with pathogens. We saw a lot of pit latrines on our trip, okay, and a lot of them, most of them, were in disrepair. They were leaking, and when we talked about how they're being emptied, many of them, the owners had 2 choices they felt. One was to manually empty it next to the pit, pile it up with garbage, and then burn it. Or the second one was when it rains, put it in the overflow of the rain stormwater runoff. We did not see a lot of emptying, proper emptying with septic trucks. A sanitation fact in Kampala is they have the KCCA, which is the sanitation arm of the government there, has documented 170,000 pit latrines serving 1 million people living in these informal settlements. And they've documented them on GPS, so they know where they are. And many of those, as we said, are in disrepair. We saw a number of vacuum trucks emptying into open fields. In this one, it was disappointing because it was literally 100 meters from a compost plant that could have safely managed that fecal sludge. We saw bucket latrines in Accra, despite that they had been outlawed, okay? But we saw a number of them. And the contamination of carrying that bucket and then, of course, emptying it into the environment is unsafe. We went on a number of vacuum truck emptying trips. This one in particular was interesting because after the pit was emptied by the vacuum truck, the owner of the vacuum truck then took all his clothes off except for his underwear and his sandals, and then the workers that he was with lowered him into that pit. And then he took off his sandals and against the walls of the pit knocked the silt and sand off that pit to preserve the integrity of that pit. After 5 or 10 minutes, they brought him back up, and he was just covered, as you can imagine, with fecal sludge. They sanitized him, showered him off with chemicals, and on his way. But this is also a practice that had been outlawed, but again, it continues. Bill talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the foundation's done research across many continents and countries and cities, and what they see time and time again is, in many cases, less than 2% of fecal sludge is being properly treated, with the rest being released to the environment. Many times there's a perception that's being managed, but then there's leaking that's happening. There's processes in waste treatment plants that are not working, and in effect, most of that fecal sludge is going back to the environment. Let's talk a little bit about the sanitation business side. And what we see there is the supply is not keeping up with the demand. Okay, so the population growth, and there's not enough supply out there of businesses. The businesses that are there are trying as hard as they can, but there's not enough things happening. The infrastructure is light. We went to 2 waste treatment plants. There aren't a lot out there, but this one, both the one in Accra and the one in Kampala, had processes and systems that were not working. We saw in this one, they had no tertiary treatment, so effectively they were dumping E. coli into the fields behind them. And oh, by the way, they had people living out there growing crops. So very unsafe. Now, this is an interesting story. John is here on the cell phone, and he runs a business called Forever Sanitation in Kampala. And first part of his story that he told was kind of a personal story. It was kind of a sad story. And that is that his wife of 10 years left him because she could no longer be married to somebody that was in the sanitation business. So there's still that stigma, that taboo, that this is not a good business to be in. So he was very sad about that. Despite that, he has got a great niche because where the vacuum trucks can't get to, those tight spaces and tight corners. He brings in these barrels on motorcycles and small trucks and does manual emptying. There's an example of one of his vehicles that he brings into these very tight spaces. And he also worked with the KCCA and the Gates Foundation to develop this gulper, which is a way to manually empty the pits. And so it's effective in terms of what it does, but of course, you can only do so much barrel by barrel, right? And so again, the supply and demand issue is still a big issue. We also met with a pit emptying association, and there was Ishmael there on the right. And what was really interesting about meeting with them was we learned about some of their issues. Okay, one of their biggest issue is travel time. In Kampala, it is up to 2 hours to travel to the waste treatment plant and back. The traffic is so bad, you just move along very slowly. And so think about that, they spend so much time on the road. 60% of their costs plus are fuel costs, and then they have maintenance costs on these used vacuum trucks that they have. The other issue that they have is debris in the pits. And so here's some examples of some of the debris: rags, trash, sandals. And when the public is doing, when the people are doing that, they're just slowing down the process. Again, making that a very unproductive process for the sanitary business, or sanitation business. The Ghana government estimates that poor sanitation costs them over $290 million a year. So the government is starting to realize that this is a big issue that needs to have more urgency. So what are some of our top takeaways from the trip? Well, I think the biggest thing is we looked at this and we realized this isn't just a technical solution problem. There's a culture issue, there are socio-economic issues. From a cultural perspective, the places we visit, they need a Mr. Toilet. They need a toilet lady. They need somebody in leadership to drive up the urgency and create a movement, okay, and change behavior. And that really needs to come from somebody saying, hey, this is really important. Okay, good sanitation is very important, and poor sanitation is making us sick and killing our children. And that urgency needs to be dialed up, and that needs to come from leadership, whether that's in government or business. The second thing that needs to happen is, and I know we're working on reinventing the toilet, but there's still hundreds of thousands of pit latrines out there, so those need to follow standards. We can't have leaking pit latrines into neighborhoods. So we need to fix the pit latrine system and make that something that is healthy and safe. The third thing is we need to make emptying easy and economical. Okay, when you look at this bucket by bucket, it's way too expensive. So we need to make sure we need to do that in a better way in terms of the emptying. And then we need to make treating waste easy and economical and safe as well. And that's really where our solution comes in. We developed, working with the foundation, a mobile septic treatment system for the 73% of the people in the world that don't have sewer pipes. This solution is called Oystra. It's up on the show floor. I hope many of you had a chance to see it. But it basically takes a septic truck's waste and turns 80% of that into pathogen-free water and the remaining 20% into concentrated solids. But the real big thing that it does is it reduces the volume of that septic truck. And so instead of making 5 trips to the waste treatment plant, we can make 1 trip. So we reduce fuel costs. We keep those vacuum trucks out in the field emptying, or the manual emptiers. We keep the manual emptiers out emptying as well, instead of doing travel throughout the cities. When we were in Uganda, we learned about 2 words. Feces is kambazi, and water is amazi. And so part of our mission was to turn kambazi into amazi. And we think we've done that, but there's still much more to do. The cultural change is really a key issue. So we know now why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sent us to Africa. It wasn't just to find a technical solution, but it was to make an emotional connection. It was that the team from Crane Engineering and other partners that we're with to make that emotional connection to the problem so we could have a higher sense of urgency to help people that we don't even know. We came back changed from Africa. We came back different than when we left. We now know who we are working for, because every child deserves a better future. Thank you very much.